Hello, and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. Of all the responsibilities that fall on the shoulders of a president, it has long been clear that foreign policy is beyond Trump's abilities. Woefully ignorant before taking office, he has done nothing to learn, and it shows. There are numerous tinderbox situations in the Middle East, all made more dangerous by Trump's impulsive, ill-informed actions. On this edition of Other Voices, we'll take a deep, authoritative look at the region's many hotspots, what Trump is up to in those areas, and what his possible, we hope probable, successors might do differently. To help guide us through this long list of hotspots, I'm very pleased to welcome Stephen Zunes, Professor of Politics and International Studies at University of San Francisco. Stephen, welcome to Other Voices.
Great to be with you.
Really glad to have you here. Stephen was the founding director of the program in Middle Eastern Studies at University of San Francisco and is recognized as one of the country's leading scholars of U.S. Middle East policy and of strategic nonviolent action. Professor Zunes serves as a senior policy analyst for the Foreign Policy in Focus project of the Institute for Policy Studies, is an associate editor of Peace Review, and a contributing editor of Tikkun magazine. He's made frequent visits to the Middle East and other conflict regions. Just got back from Sudan, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that before the hour is out. Lots of travel where he's met with top government officials, academics, journalists, and opposition leaders. So last week I couldn't have started out this way because we had 6 candidates and it would have taken forever to go through 6 presidential candidates and their positions on some of these spots in the Middle East, but we suddenly find ourselves down to 2, so let me start there. Why don't we start with comparing and contrasting the people who are trying to take over the White House, what their positions might be, and then we'll take a look at what the U.S. policy is now. So let's start with the Israel-Palestine conflict. Mm-hmm. Trump just rolled out his big peace plan. We'll talk about that in a minute. What are the visions that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have toward this region? Is it substantially different than the trajectory of U.S. policy over many years? Try to introduce us to this.
Well, both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are committed to Israel's right to exist in peace and security. Bernie is Jewish, and he actually lived in Israel for a short time in his youth, working on a kibbutz. But they couldn't be more different in their approach. Bernie believes that Israel should withdraw from the occupied territories, stop the illegal colonization of the occupied territories, and has generally done a major job in doing work in trying to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. He's been quite active in trying to shift U.S. policy away from the traditional, let Israel do pretty much whatever he wants. He's spoken out against Israeli war crimes, for example. We've also had. Biden couldn't be more different. Biden is definitely more on the hawkish wing of the party. He's very much someone who has defended Israeli violations of international legal norms. He has engaged in, he co-sponsored, as far back as 1994, he co-sponsored a resolution calling on the United States to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and recognize Jerusalem as the sole capital. Way back in '94, he pushed it every few years. It was a big thing of his. But the bill, the mandating the move, left it to the president to waive it or not. And it was too extreme even for George W. Bush, but Trump finally enacted Biden's resolution by doing that. Biden's also attacked the International Court of Justice when it said Israel could build a separation wall along its internationally recognized border, but it couldn't build it in this serpentine fashion deep inside the West Bank as a way of incorporating these illegal settlements. Well, Biden attacked the World Court, saying that it's an attack against Israel's right to self-defense. They have no business dealing with questions of international humanitarian law in the occupied territories, which of course is one of the functions of the World Court. He's even attacked the United Nations from getting involved, saying the UN should not be involved. It should be just between the Israeli occupiers and the Palestinians under occupation decide among themselves what should happen, ignoring, of course, the gross asymmetry in power between the two. When he was vice president, he undermined President Obama's, a timid push to get the Israelis to compromise. He was basically seen as the Israelis' best friend in the White House.
Undermined how?
Oh, basically to make it clear that not to take Obama's pressure too seriously. That it would not really, they really wouldn't do anything about it. That he
was just talking.
Yeah, exactly, and basically did not. He's very much been part. I mean, if you were to look at sort of in Israeli political language. Sanders is closer to Meretz, which is a left Zionist party, whereas Biden's closer to Likud. Or if you look in terms of American politics, Bernie's closer to J Street, whereas Biden is very much in the AIPAC wing,
sort of guy.
wing of things.
Explain quickly what J Street is.
J Street is a liberal Zionist group that supports a secure Israel, but realizes that in order for there to be a secure Israel and for there to be peace, Israel needs to withdraw from the occupied territories and stop the expansion of settlements.
So one of the things I did to prepare for this, because it's hard to find any real information on these candidate websites, mm-hmm. I read the rather lengthy New York Times editorial board interviews with both of these candidates. One thing that's where they seem to be very diametrically opposed is they both said they would continue U.S. aid to Israel, mm-hmm. which is $4 billion a year, mm-hmm. still around. Mm-hmm. But Bernie Sanders made a very, went out of his way to make a point that we should be using that aid to leverage things that we want out of Israel. Biden just skipped that question entirely.
I mean, I just skipped it, but in various other interviews, he had denounced Sanders and Warren, who'd made the same position, even Buttigieg, who mentioned that possibility as being totally irresponsible, that under no circumstances should we condition our aid to Israel. This is despite what Amnesty International and the majority of the American public have long been saying, that aid to Israel, like aid to any country, should be contingent on human rights norms and a willingness to make peace.
Yeah. As far as I remember, it was only George H.W. Bush who actually went so far as to threaten to hold up loan guarantees over settlement building. That was a long time ago. I don't think anybody else has actually conditioned aid on some kind of behavior.
Yeah. Unless you want to go back to Eisenhower, but yes.
So I am right. It was George H.W. Bush's only
right, and he had to modify that when he was getting a lot of pressure from the Democratic nominee Bill Clinton, who once he came to office ended up converting many of the Congress had agreed to reduce the amount of the loan guarantee from the $2 billion annual installment for the cost of building new settlements and infrastructure. And basically what Clinton did was, don't worry about it, we'll make it up to you. And sure enough, he raised U.S. aid to Israel by the $500 million or so dollars. So basically he knew the message was to the Israelis was, the more settlements you build, we will convert a loan guarantee into a grant.
All right. Anything else we should know about their positions that stands out to you? I mean, U.S. policy in regards
I think this is an area. Well, there's been a huge shift in the Democratic Party on this issue. I mean, a huge shift. That it used to be one that every U.S. candidate for president had to go to AIPAC on an election year to speak. And not only did Warren and Sanders refuse to go, but Buttigieg and Klobuchar, Klobuchar is a big surprise because she's pretty hawkish as well, declined. And that is a huge shift, and I think it reflects the public opinion. I mean, there is it used to be you could go as far as to the right as you wanted to, and it would not hurt you politically. But people in the broader liberal peace wing of the party, who used to just kind of avoid talking about Israel and says, well, yeah, well, they kind of have to do that. Let's endorse them. Let's support them unconditionally. Anyway, no, it's getting more like Central America in the '80s and other issues where people are saying, hey, wait a minute. No, this is wrong. This is not necessarily an anti-Zionist thing or an anti-Israel thing. We shouldn't be supporting governments that are doing the kind of things that Netanyahu is doing. And in fact, we have a serious contender like Sanders overtly calling the Prime Minister of Israel a racist. I mean, that's huge. And in fact, at times he was interrupted by applause when he and Warren and other critics talked about this. So we were, but unfortunately, Biden is way back in that kind of starry-eyed idealism of Israel from Paul Newman in Exodus in the early '60s. You know, that is, he really has not recognized that things are changing both in Israel and here in the United States.
Here in the United States, I think that's true. I've been doing this long enough that, as I'm sure you know, you get beat up a lot if you dare to criticize certain countries around here. Let's go from our candidates to Israel just had their third election in a year. And let's talk about the results about that and where that takes this entire issue into the future.
Well,
and I say this, we know that the results aren't complete yet. It takes them longer to count ballots than California.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, just as Americans, and American Jews in particular, are moving more and more to the left on the question of Israel and Palestine. Israel's going the opposite direction. It's going more and more to the right. I mean, the so-called moderate alternative to Netanyahu was a general who was in charge of the 2014 Israeli offensive in Gaza, you know, which Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and various Israeli human rights groups denounced for serious war crimes. And he was at best center-right. So it was a center-right and far-right basically was the choice, and it looks like the far-right will probably be able to assemble another coalition. And so it's looking.
Let's catch the audience up just in case somebody doesn't understand. In Israel, you need to have majority plus one seats in the parliament.
And they have proportional representation, which I think is a good thing actually.
Yes.
And it really does represent, gives people a chance not just to vote for the lesser evil, but to vote for a party that they believe in.
Yeah.
But the problem is, though, sometimes it's very hard to hobble together that kind of majority.
Go ahead. Shut it off.
I thought it was off already. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I thought it was off. I don't know why this happened, but
this is organic television, folks.
Right. But so Netanyahu is going to probably be able to put together another coalition, including some far-right parties. It shows the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy. In every government, including Obama's, the U.S. position was if the Palestine Authority had even one cabinet member who was a member of Hamas or any other group that didn't recognize Israel's right to exist, didn't commit to the agreements that have been made at Oslo and since then didn't renounce violence. They cut off all aid, contact, anything with the Palestine Authority. However, in Netanyahu's coalition government, and his likely future coalition government, there are extremist Israeli parties which have openly called for tearing up the Oslo Accords, for ethnically cleansing Palestinians who have ties to these right-wing settler militia which have committed acts of terrorism. And so it's one of the many areas of the double standards the United States has in dealing with Israelis and Palestinians.
So he's going to be making deals with these small parties.
These extreme right parties, even further right than him.
In order to get over the hump.
He did just as he did last time. And these parties are already in government. And it looks like they'll be in government again. But that doesn't bother Trump, of course, who's top Middle East people, including his ambassador to Israel, actually has some ties to these right-wing settler groups. So,
what kind of ties?
He's funded some of these extremist settler groups. He's basically he doesn't even believe in even a pretend two-state solution. He is said that people like in J Street, who support Israel but want to end the occupation, are worse than capos, which was the term used for Jewish collaborators with the Nazis. And this is our ambassador to Israel.
That's our ambassador to Israel. One thing, the impression I got, and I'm not up to speed on Israeli elections, but I understand that what they call the joint list of the Arab parties. There's a certain Arab population within Israel, and they vote and they run candidates, and they won more seats this year than they ever have because they came together. I think 15 seats. Is that significant?
Well, yes, it is. In fact, for the first time, they're attracting a fair amount of left-wing Jewish support. The Israeli left had traditionally supported Meretz and some of the more left Zionist parties, but an increasing number of Israelis no longer even see themselves as Zionists, but post-Zionist, in the sense they believe that, maybe a two-state solution, maybe an Israeli-Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state could have worked. But at this point, the settlements have changed the demographics so much that a contiguous, viable West Bank state is no longer possible, and that they need to start looking seriously at a binational state or some kind of state where there can be guaranteed individual and collective rights of both Arabs and Jews. So we're seeing a greater polarization in Israeli society, just as we're having in the United States and a lot of other countries in the world.
Yeah. How has the Trump-Jared Kushner peace plan been received in Israel, in Palestine, and in the region?
Well, both Netanyahu and his rival Barry Gantz endorsed it enthusiastically. It was not, again, an illustration of how little difference it is in the two major blocs in Israeli politics.
Although Gantz said he would want to work with the international community before annexing part of the West Bank. That seemed to be the only difference between the two of them. And I don't even know what that means, because the international community is opposed to that, because it violates international law.
Very much so, though maybe he considers the Trump administration part of the international community, which has endorsed the annexation of Golan. This is the first time, with the exception of Australia temporarily recognizing Indonesia's annexation of East Timor, I don't think any major country has recognized a nation expanding its territory by military force since the signing of the UN Charter. Until Trump's recognition
of that kind of behavior.
His annexation of Golan, and the likely support of Israeli annexation of large swaths of the West Bank. So the concerns here are not just those of us who are concerned about Israel and Palestine, but those of us who are concerned about international law in general, because the precedent here is very, very bad.
Yeah, our own laws are having trouble standing up these days, let alone international law, which already stands on a pretty shaky platform. Is the Trump peace plan, and I've got to use the scare quotes each time, is it going anywhere, or are we just...
No, it's not going anywhere. I mean, basically, it
won't form the basis for...
It's like a South African Bantustan, those notorious tribal homelands that were segmented and surrounded by white South Africa, a similar kind of thing, that it doesn't come close to the amount of total land that the Palestinians were hoping for in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, in 20% of historic Palestine. That's all they're asking for now. But the U.S. consensus under both Republican and Democratic administrations that was too much. They had to settle for even less. But Trump's plan is not only a big reduction in the total amount of land, but again, it's subdivided in these tiny non-contiguous cantons, and with even within those, there are these large Jewish enclaves, including downtown Hebron, one of the largest cities in the West Bank, and not a single settlement would be removed in this plan. And so, and if anybody's been to the West Bank, they're just all over the place. I mean, it's just how they can divide that up is just really hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Israel will control the internet. They control the airspace, control the aquifers, control the control the comings and goings. Not just, obviously they can control comings and going to their own country, but between the Palestinian state and any neighboring Arab state, or even between segments of the Palestinian state. So it's nothing close to anything resembling a viable nation state. No Palestinian leader could accept that.
So for activists here in this country, what should we be looking for these days? Is there any initiative that people should be backing, or?
Well, I mean, I think.
Is the boycott movement?
Well, first we got to make sure, if you're concerned with Israeli-Palestinian peace, you need to make sure that Trump is not reelected, and that Biden isn't elected either. And frankly, because remember, Biden supported the Sharon plan, the convergence plan, back in 2004, which is very, very similar to the Trump plan. Really not a whole lot of difference.
Yeah.
He's not. You can't expect for him to move things forward as well. And I think we also need to, to address it not on ideological grounds. I mean, I don't want to get into arguments about Zionism and defining Zionism, anti-Zionism, whatever. But let's talk about just basic principles like human rights, international law, and self-determination, and how U.S. policy has not only not brought any justice for Palestinians, it's not brought security for Israel either. Yeah. And that Palestinian rights and Israeli security are not mutually exclusive, but ultimately mutually dependent upon the other. And the United States has been supporting some of the most reactionary elements within Israel, which in turn creates a backlash from some of the more reactionary elements in Palestinian society, like Hamas.
Yeah. So, no apparent way out.
Yeah, but look, East Timor used to be a hopeless cause.
That's true.
Ending apartheid seemed like a hopeless cause. I mean, there are people in the studio audience here who I'm sure were involved in the struggles and more, and we saw how we initially had very little support among in Congress, even among Democrats, but we kept on struggling, kept on working, and pretty sure it shifted. And again, we're already seeing a big shift. As I mentioned, not necessarily in some of the top leaders, but certainly on the grassroots on Israel and Palestine.
Yeah. As always, it's a long, hard road, and you just got to keep walking down that road. Let's shift our attention over to Iran for a little bit. In the wake of the assassination of Soleimani and almost coming to direct confrontation, the U.S. has cranked up sanctions yet again on Iran, more oil sanctions, metals, consumer goods, manufacturing. They've sanctioned a whole bunch of individuals in the Iranian government, both in the military and within their civilian government.
Even their foreign minister is one of the leading moderates whom I got to meet with for a full hour in Tehran about a year ago. He's on the list, even though he has absolutely nothing to do with the hardline elements that are some of the bad things you're doing.
I suspect the Trump administration is running out of people and items to sanction.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they just keep going down the list. So how is maximum pressure working?
It's terrible. I mean, that it has really put the economy in tailspin. But I mean, part of it is, frankly, the Iranian government has been grossly mismanaging the economy. There's a lot of corruption. It would not be in great shape anyway, but it's gotten even worse as a result of these draconian sanctions, which are hurting ordinary people more. And as Foreign Minister Zarif explained a year ago, and we're seeing this even more so, that he put a lot of stake into negotiating this treaty. The hardliners were saying, no, you can't trust the United States. If you do what the United States has, we're going to have to destroy billions of dollars of military equipment and fuel and centrifuges and pour concrete into a brand new reactor. I mean, there's billions of dollars and years of research, and be unique and having real strict limitations, far more than almost any other country on our nuclear program, even as just for nuclear power, nuclear medicine, and whatever. But and what's going to stop the United States from, after we've done all this, to just reimposing the sanctions? And Zarif and President Rouhani said, no, you can trust the United States. It's an international agreement. Everything's going to be fine.
And because it wasn't just the United States.
Yeah. This is a seven-party agreement.
Yeah.
But with the United States pulling out, basically what Trump has been doing is it punishes companies in other countries, and if they're state-owned, the countries themselves, if they have any business with Iran. So almost any company, let's say Total, the major French petroleum company, if they went through and honored their contracts with Iran, they would completely cut off from the U.S. market. And of course, the U.S. market is bigger. So in a sense, it's reimposed the entire international sanctions regime on Iran, even though all the other parties of the agreement didn't like what the United States did. And so the hardliners are on the ascendancy. And their purges of the moderates
in Iran.
We
know they're in.
Yeah. I mean, because and people like Zarif and Rouhani are now marginalized because of this. So that's particularly upsetting. I think people in the pro-democracy movement in Iran who've been struggling against this reactionary regime all these years has really set back their effort because when they're under that kind of pressure, people tend to rally around the flag.
Yeah. As we saw after the assassination of Soleimani, these massive demonstrations. I got to think with coronavirus hitting Iran really hard. It's one of the hardest hit countries in the world. What effect do we know? What effect the U.S. sanctions are having on their ability to respond?
It's one of the reasons it's one of the epicenters, in large part because they can't get a lot of the medicines and hospital equipment, that kind of thing. Not that medical supplies are part of this ban,
right.
but just in terms of having the cash and being able to transfer funds and just the whole transactional side of it, it makes it all the more difficult to get even legal supplies in.
What about the possibility, it does seem to have reduced recently, but continued threat of direct military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran?
It's still very high. I mean, I don't think Trump is necessarily wants war with Iran. I think he naively thinks that brinkmanship will get them to buckle. I mean, he made his. I mean, that's how he got around New York, is basically bullying people and threatening people and going up to the brink, and eventually people would fold, or the New York City government would fold, or whatever, and he'd come out as a winner. So that's sort of his style of play, but that doesn't work in international diplomacy. And I think the big mistake the United States has made with Iran, not just with Trump, but overall, is that we see it in terms of its Islamist characteristics and not the strong sense of nationalism they have. I mean, if you use the analogy of Vietnam, a big mistake in Vietnam was we saw this as communist expansionism. How do you stop a spreading totalitarian movement? You do it with military force. Yet, even though North Vietnam was a communist country and the National Liberation Front, what we call the Viet Cong, was communist-led, it was first and foremost a nationalist movement.
Right.
So we couldn't understand why the more we bombed, the more troops we sent, the higher the resistance.
Yeah.
And this is the exact same thing happening with Iran, because the Iranians are some of those nationalistic people in the world. And if any of you all know people from a Persian background, you know how proud people are of their heritage.
And rightfully so.
Yeah, very much so. And so. When Trump is trying to push Iran around like it's a banana republic, ignoring the fact that they've been a major regional power on and off for the past 2,500 years, it's simply not going to work. It's creating this reaction. Again, it's paradoxically strengthening the regime instead of weakening it.
Yeah. Let's go back to our candidates now. Mm-hmm. Where do they stand, Joe Biden on Iran?
Well, both of them want to go back to the agreement. I don't know if that's possible. I mean, again, the hardliners are now on the ascendancy, and it could be difficult. And if that doesn't work, I think that's where the differences might come in. Biden supported a plank in the 2016 Democratic platform that called for military action against Iran if they reneged on the agreement. This is despite the fact that the agreement did not.
It has mechanisms.
Have mechanisms, and in no way will allow any one of the six co-signatories to launch a unilateral strike. That would be a direct violation of the UN Charter and everything else.
So that was a plank in the Democratic platform.
Yeah, 2016. That Biden was
Biden
supported. Yeah. And Bernie is very much opposed to that kind of thing. I mean, I think he's certainly concerned with the problem of nuclear proliferation, but I think he takes a more holistic view. I think Bernie is the kind of person who would push for a nuclear free zone for the entire Middle East, similar to what, and South Asia, and he's similar to where there are already nuclear weapons free zones in Latin America, in Africa, in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Antarctic, and South Pacific. And Sanders would support something like a similar nuclear weapons free zone in South and Southwest Asia as well. But the United States has traditionally rejected that because our allies, Israel, Pakistan, and India, have nuclear weapons, and we like to bring nuclear weapons in on our ships. And so we were practicing kind of nuclear apartheid, basically. We and our allies can have nuclear weapons, but Iran can't even have a nuclear program that might even have the potential someday of becoming weaponized. And generally, arms control agreements don't work unless there's reciprocity, unless there's mutuality in it.
Right.
And again, this is really, again, that strong sense of nationalism. It's like, why are we being singled out this way? This is completely unfair. I mean, there are given that Iraq attacked them with chemical weapons and the world didn't respond, and the United States has threatened to attack them. Israel's threatened to attack them. Israel has nuclear submarines off their coast in the Persian Gulf, as we do, we do as well. And so one might understand why they might want a deterrent. But again, the U.S. is saying no. We can't. That you can't have this kind of thing. And it's not just we're enforcing UN resolutions, because UN Security Council Resolutions 487 calls on Israel to place its nuclear facilities under the trusteeship of the International Atomic Energy Agency. They've been violating that resolution for close to 30 years now, and we have still.
They won't even admit they have nuclear weapons.
And Pakistan and India have been violating Security Council Resolution 1172 since the late 90s, well over 20 years. And so, as again, an example of the double standards our foreign policy has had on non-proliferation issues.
And I believe it was at the end of the 1991 Gulf War in Iraq that the U.S. called for a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East.
Actually, we didn't. The resolution, the end of the Gulf War, did call for 687, I think, called for Iraqi disarmament in the context of region-wide disarmament, but we never enforced that part.
No, not region-wide, just certain people, as you say. All right. Anything else on Iran? In terms of our candidates that we should be paying attention to?
That kind of covers the basics of it, yeah.
Okay, we're going to turn to our studio audience for some questions and answers. Julia will be coming around with the microphone, and because of the virus going around, she's just going to hold the mic. Don't grab it and pass it around, okay? But we're going to take a little quick break first. We've produced a public service announcement. This is kind of like what I'm going to ask you to participate in afterwards. So we're going to take a 1-minute break. You'll see most of it up here on the screen, and then we'll be right back with Stephen Zunes, professor of politics and international studies at University of San Francisco. Let's roll the tape, as they say.
It's under attack! What do we do? Stand up like that! What do we want? Climate justice! What do we want it? Now! What do we want? Climate justice! What do we want it? Now! The earth we need is under attack. What do we do? Stand up like that! When the earth we need is under attack, what do we do? Stand up like that! Tell me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Tell me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like!
And I will just mention, we hope you will all join us on April 24th for the Global Climate Strike March and Rally here in Palo Alto. And next month's Other Voices program will be on all the various events going on. April 22nd, of course, is Earth Day. There's going to be climate strike actions on that Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. We'll have the organizers of a lot of these actions here on the show next month. That will be April 7th. And we had Peninsula Peace and Justice Center had over 1,000 people out last September where some of this footage was shot. We hope to double that, barring any coronaviruses and things like that. So if you have a question, please hold up your hand and wait for Julia to arrive with the microphone. I'm not seeing any hands. Oh, here we go. All right, we've got some hands. And then if you would stand up, and Julia will hold the microphone for you. Face this way. She'll take care.
Excuse my ignorance, but what is APAC?
APAC is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is a lobbying organization. It's not a PAC as in Political Action Committee. They don't give money directly to candidates, so they have allied PACs that do that. And it's traditionally called itself the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. So J Street would say, we're also a pro-Israel lobby, we're just not a right-wing pro-Netanyahu lobby. A lot of people see them as very, very powerful, which, well, relatively speaking, they are, but I think it's sometimes exaggerated in the sense that it's not explains our bias towards Israel. I mean, for example, we supported Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. We supported apartheid South Africa's occupation in Namibia. To this day, we support Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. It's not like we need a ethnic lobby to force us to support allies engaging in invasions, occupations, colonization, suppression of weaker neighbors, and similarly, the rationalizations for Israeli war crimes in Lebanon and Gaza and elsewhere isn't that much different than our rationalization for Saudi war crimes in Yemen, or, my God, what we've done in places like Iraq and elsewhere. I think basically I challenge a sense that try to blame AIPAC for everything, because unfortunately it's much it's deeper than that. It's the problems we have in about U.S. foreign policy elsewhere as well. Middle East is not a big exception. I guess the one area AIPAC does have some clout is that there's some otherwise liberal members of Congress that will take some pretty hardline positions where they might have taken more moderate positions otherwise, but Congress usually doesn't make foreign policy, and most of these so-called pro-Israel resolutions they're passed are non-binding. So I would say that it complicates. It makes dissent more difficult. It makes dissenting voices more difficult to hear, and critical dialogue more difficult. But the overall thrust of U.S. foreign policy, I believe, would be more or less the same, even if AIPAC didn't exist.
Okay, and another question in the back here.
Well, since you've just come back from Sudan, which is an area of the world that I felt kind of hopeless about for so many decades, and it seems like maybe there's some exciting stuff going on in Africa at this point. I wondered if you could comment on what's going on.
Yeah, it's fine to segue. It's not the Middle East. But
Yeah, actually Sudan is the Middle East in the sense. Yeah, they remember the Arab League, and they're very much the Arabic is a national language. Okay. There are a large number of non-Arabic speakers. It's a multi-ethnic society, but majority Arab. So it's very exciting there. I mean, and that for 30 years they lived under one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world. I mean, literally genocidal. Al-Bashir has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity in Darfur. Civil society had been decimated. The country, there were some small-scale civil wars, not just in Darfur, but in the Nuba Mountains and other parts of the country. Literacy was high. The military government had made an alliance with this far right-wing Islamist party, so women were suppressed, couldn't leave the home without male relatives, had to cover up, all that kind of thing. And yet, remarkably, starting in December 2018, a massive nonviolent movement emerged. And it was one of the most disciplined nonviolent movements, not even rock throwing or anything like that. It was quite remarkable, practically Gandhian in their nonviolent discipline. And again, this is a place that has wars all over the place. In fact, the opposition had an armed struggle, from that lasted from for almost a decade, starting in the 90s. But this time they decided to go completely nonviolent. And by April, with millions of people in the street, it forced al-Bashir from power. The military overthrew them. And then, unlike the Egyptians, they didn't say thank the military and go home. They said, we want you guys out of there as well. And they kept on struggling. And this is despite hundreds of people being gunned down. I mean, they kept on going, and then negotiated a power-sharing agreement in August, where some military people are still in government, but it is primarily civilian. Civilians are leading both the executive and constitutional and quasi-legislative branches. They'll be having elections in a few months. But it was quite amazing to think about, especially since women and young people were very much in the lead here. The fact that women embraced the memory of the Kandaka, who were this powerful matrilineal series of powerful queens during the first millennium BC. It's from actually is where the name Candace comes from. It's and they kept on having their murals of the Kandaka all over the place, and T-shirts, and just really reclaiming their power. That the misogynist regime, they challenging the myth that the kind of misogyny that the regime was trying to impose had anything to do with Sudanese history or culture. And so it was just very impressive. Now it's a struggle. They've twice overthrown governments before nonviolently, in 1964 and 1985, only to have the military come back within 5 or 6 years. They're hoping that this movement, because it was more organic and had a stronger grassroots base, it may hold on, but they have to improve the economy, which was totally wrecked by this incredibly corrupt and inept government. Unfortunately, Trump still has them on the state sponsors of terrorism list, even though they threw out the people who were involved in that kind of thing, and they even added Sudan to the no-fly list just recently. Again, even despite this democracy, so that's really hurting their economy. And like with the Iranian sanctions, it makes it very difficult for third parties in other countries, other companies, or international financial institutions to come in as well. If Sudanese American wants to send money to his family, they have to go through banks in Qatar, and transaction fees. It's real complicated, and so the Sudanese government's been giving in to various demands by the United States since the Bashir briefly harbored Al Qaeda in the 90s. He successfully gotten the Sudanese, again impoverished country, to pay a huge amount of money to the United States for the Al Qaeda attack on the SS Cole in Aden Harbor in Yemen back in the 1990s, and I mean things like this. So they're really struggling, and it's such a hopeful sign. I mean, in a sense, though, that they were able to do this, and like so few people even heard about this thing, and you wonder why haven't more of us heard about this remarkable nonviolent revolution. And frankly, I think it's because a black, Arab, African, Middle Eastern people having agency, thinking strategically, applying nonviolent action effectively simply doesn't fit into the Western narrative. And so I think I really hope that some of us here can help spread the word.
In fact, you were kind of received as a hero because you've been paying attention and talking about Sudan, and from what you put on Facebook, you seemed a little surprised.
Oh yeah. It was a bit awkward because I was there to learn from them. It was a research trip. Yeah. Because one of my research areas is nonviolent civil resistance against authoritarian regimes, and because it fit all the categories of why it supposedly wouldn't work. And they did it, and I wanted to find out more. So I was there to interview people and learn about it.
And rewrite the textbook.
Right. But they had me give a couple of lectures at these universities. There were these huge crowds. They took me to this neighborhood committee where they had signs welcoming me, because apparently some of my writings have been translated into Arabic, along with those of Gene Sharp and other people who write on nonviolent action. And there was actually a mural with my name on it, along with Congresswoman Jayapal and Richard Turner, the African American journalist, and Michael Nagler, who some of you know, and and
Yeah.
other NGO people. But yeah,
To me, it tells me, and I traveled to Central America during the war years down there in the 80s. And it is so important for people who are struggling to get the attention of the American people, not necessarily the government, but the American people. Why do you think that is?
I mean, given how much influence we have in the world, I think there's a lot of parochialism here. I mean, really even basic things like geography.
Yeah.
People don't know. I mean, that's why Ray can get away with saying that Grenada was a transshipment point for Cuban arms to terrorists in Central America, because most Americans didn't know Grenada was in the opposite direction from Cuba, Central America. But you know, it's. But I think it's really what gives me hope is that the United States is becoming a more diverse nation, and here in California we are particularly blessed by that we get to hear narratives of people from other countries and other places and other perspectives, and younger people, thanks to the internet and social media, have friends around the world and are hearing those stories.
Yeah.
I think one reason why, with the exception of GLBTQ issues, there's hardly any issue that parallels age more than Israel-Palestine. That younger people are much more sympathetic to the Palestinian side than people our age. And I mean, when I first started teaching Middle East politics, 30, 35 years ago, I had to bend over backwards to make sure people had heard the Palestinian narrative, because I assumed they came in with knowing the Israeli narrative.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I always have to go the other direction, the other way around.
That's
I mean, really,
interesting.
it's quite striking. And part of it is, again, we're in a more diverse society, but also that people who get their news more through online sources as opposed to the mainstream media, get to see these eyewitness accounts of what's happening in places like the West Bank, like in Sudan. In fact, a lot of young people knew about Sudan because of the Blue for Sudan meme that appeared on social media after the martyrdom of a charismatic 23-year-old activist, and his supporters got that out, and so we want about the people who spend too much time on their phones or on the internet, but it sometimes does do a good job of getting the word out about these obscure struggles that you will not hear from the mainstream media.
Yeah, there are some benefits.
Yeah.
Okay, back to the audience. I think I see a hand here. If you'll stand up, please.
What impact do you think that the population growth in the Middle East is having on the problems? Like, I think Egypt is one of the highest birth rates in the world. The Palestinians have a very high birth rate. The Israeli right wing has a very high birth rate. I don't know about Sudan, but many of those countries have very high birth rates in a small area. So what impact will that have?
As it has in other places of rapid population growth and limited resources, it puts real strains economically. Even if the countries are growing at a healthy 2 or 3% pace, if the population is growing that much, it's no net growth. Not to mention the impact on the environment, and especially in areas like Egypt, where 96% of the land is desert. Everybody's crowded along the Nile Valley and the Delta. Makes it more difficult, and the Palestinians are getting boxed in more and more as they're surrounded by Israeli settlements, and Israel won't let Palestinians expand much. I mean, these demographic pressures are very real. But generally, as we found in much of the world, initially in Europe and now in Asia and parts of Latin America, where the birth rate drops, is when people are secure, when people have their basic needs met, when people aren't afraid that their children are going to die, either from malnutrition, disease, or violence. And so I think for those of us concerned about rapid population growth, I think our priority, I mean, obviously family planning, empowering women, and all that kind of stuff is good and important. But I think we also need to look at the conditions which create the insecurity that drive people to have extra children, and to and that's something that the United States can have an impact on in terms of supporting sustainable development, in terms of ending the Israeli occupation, in terms of encouraging democratization instead of propping up dictatorships and the like.
Okay, thank you for the question. Another one here in the audience. Here comes the microphone.
You talked about Israel and Palestine and Iran. So my question is, what can we do to end U.S. support for Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's an important one. I'm really glad you raised that.
Reserve the studio for another hour,
Tens
please.
of thousands, tens of thousands of people have died from U.S.-made ordnance dropped from U.S.-made planes that have been supported by U.S. Troops in Saudi bases who have been training and engaging in maintenance and in targeting by the Saudi armed forces.
You're talking about Yemen, the war. In
Yeah,
Yemen.
the bombing in Yemen. It is a huge crime, and I mean, we were justifiably horrified with the slaughter that Assad has inflicted upon urban areas in Syria, and at least some people were upset at the crimes Israel has committed in crowded areas in Gaza and elsewhere. But there's been relatively little attention done to the genocidal war being waged by the Saudis. It took the tens of thousands of Yemeni deaths didn't seem to have much impact, but the death of one Washington Post journalist was enough to shift opinion in Congress to finally call for an end of arms transfers to Saudi Arabia. But then Trump declared a state of emergency where he said our vital national security interests are at stake, so I'm going to continue sending arms there anyway. And with his appointed judges upholding this unilateral executive action, we've done little to the slaughter continues. I mean, I really wish we were doing some of the stuff we were doing back in the 80s and around Central America, but blockading rail lines and ports and other places where they're shipping this kind of this lethal equipment there, because it is an incredible tragedy. But the good news is, I think this is one thing that a Democrat in the White House, even Biden, might shift, because in the 2016 Democratic platform, there was a plank that called for, that went on and on about all the terrible things about Iran. But every one of the things they listed were even more true with Saudi Arabia, and they didn't mention that. In fact, all they said we should strengthen our security cooperation with Gulf states. So as recently as 4 years ago, the Democrats were supporting the Saudis, and the bombing had been going on for at least a couple of years then.
Yes.
But again, thanks to the Khashoggi murder, that even people like Biden, who are big supporters of the Saudi regime, are now realizing that politically it's impossible to justify that anymore. And hopefully this will end if a Democrat gets in the White House in January.
Sanders, of course, has been kind of a leading voice.
Yeah, he was the leader.
adding,
He was a leader on the Senate floor and doing this. So ironically, he got support from Mike Lee, a conservative Republican from Utah, and they were the co-sponsors of the bill.
Yeah. There's that old saying about politics and strange bedfellows.
Of course, the big difference, of course, that I want to see if I can throw this in our last couple of minutes is that Sanders has been emphasizing that he was the floor leader when he was in the House of Representatives against the authorization of military force, use of military force to invade Iraq, whereas Biden was not only voting for the war and repeating Bush-Cheney talking points, he, as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, only allowed for a day and a half of hearings. The most important foreign policy decision of a generation. And he only allowed a day and a half of hearings, and he blocked anti-war witnesses from testifying. He stacked the hearings with pro-war people. And remember, the Democrats controlled the Senate then. They could have stopped the war, prevented all this horror, but Biden played the key role in getting it through. And there's actually a short 20-minute documentary in which I'm briefly featured that Mark Weisbrot put together, narrated by Danny Glover. Danny Glover is narrator. It talks about that looks at this very issue about Biden and the war. So if you can Google that documentary, Biden, Iraq War, Danny Glover, it should come up.
Okay. We do have just a couple of minutes left. You talked about Trump just ignored the congressional action on Yemen. One thing that's currently active, that the House and Senate have both passed war powers resolutions to try to keep Trump from from attacking Iran. The Senate version is slightly different, so it's headed back to the House. What do you see playing out on that, on the war powers, and how important is that to get that passed? I know you said earlier you think some of the chance of a direct conflict is lessened a bit, but it's still very much there.
We're a hair-trigger kind of situation, and again, I don't think Trump necessarily wants a war, but when you gauge that kind of brinkmanship, we came so close to war.
Yeah,
so close to war a few years ago. And of course, let's remember, we wouldn't be close to war if we hadn't invaded Iraq, because the issue is American bases being supposedly threatened by Iranian-backed militia. Prior to the invasion, there were no American bases and there were no Iranian-backed militia. These were a direct consequence of the invasion.
Yeah.
But
I have to ask you to wrap it up.
Yeah.
10 seconds.
Okay. But briefly, I'm afraid Trump will veto it. We may not have enough to override. But given that the War Powers Act of 1971 should have covered this already, and it hasn't, I don't think legislation enough is going to do it. What we need is people power to make sure that if you try something like that, we're going to shut this country down.
All right. Yes. My guest has been Professor Stephen Zunes, Professor of Politics and International Studies at University of San Francisco. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I know you're busy. I really appreciate it. Thank you all. We'll be back April 7th with a special on the global climate strikes coming up in later April. Thanks. You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice.